Have you ever wondered what your superpower is? Well, this episode is for you because today's guest is a licensed attorney who has influenced policy change at all levels of the government for over 2 decades. But what's most notable is when she's not influencing change within the government, she is sipping wine as a certified sommelier while teaching leadership. Our guest today is going to be talking about her journey in discovering her superpower and how you can do the same. Thanks for joining us today, Betty.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Well, you and I have known each other for some time, and I have just been dying to have you on the podcast. So I'm so excited to have you on. Tell our listeners you have such a unique background as an attorney and then influencing change within the government. And now you're doing speaking. Tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to where you're at today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am an attorney. I went to law school and unfortunately, about halfway through, discovered that while I loved law school, being a lawyer was not so much for me. And it was one of those things where I didn't want to quit, but I needed to quickly figure out how I could direct this education into a career that made sense for me. And so I really wanted to help people at the end of the day. And so public service was calling me. I found my way to DC. I worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs for many, many years, then transitioned to the nonprofit community, serving still the military and veteran arena. And that was my life for a long time, like you said, almost 2 decades. And I was looking for a change. I was looking for a shift. And this concept of superpowers really did come into my thinking. If you remember from when you and I first started working together, we were talking about what are you good at? What do you love to do? What could you do with your eyes closed? And one of the things that I have always been is a performer. My mom says that I was singing coming out the womb. I manage a competitive karaoke league. So I love speaking. I love being in front of people. So it made sense to me to pursue something in that regard, but also coming from that military environment, that male dominated environment. Something else that was in the back of my mind was I've seen so many women, and I've been that woman who, in order to get a seat at the table, made themselves small or changed the way that they showed up. And that doesn't feel good and it's not sustainable. And so I really set out in this next phase of my career to help primarily women really use public speaking as a tool to level up in their leadership, in their career development, in their overall communication. And it's been really fun to help people understand that, hey, public speaking doesn't have to be scary. And what we can do is we can, like I said, use it as a tool and leverage it to let everyone's individual superpower really shine through and make a difference.
Okay, let's talk speaking because there's a statistic out there that more than 75% of people fear public speaking. So even the thought of I've got to speak in front of my peers at a business meeting, I have to present a presentation, they're shaking at the knees. They
Right.
can't even imagine that you would want to do this for a living. So kind of help us understand what are the common roadblocks that you see with people when they're just saying, I can't do this. There's that fear. And how do you help them develop that unstoppable grit to face their fears and to achieve what they want to achieve?
Such a good question. I think the first and most important thing is just a framing issue. So, a lot of people, when they hear public speaking, they immediately think on a stage, behind a podium, or in front of thousands of people, everyone's eyes on them. And that is really intimidating, right? And that is just one kind of speaking. So, what I like to do when I'm working with people is completely reframe the definition of public speaking. For me, in my work, public speaking is anytime you are speaking to someone other than yourself. The voices in your head don't count, sorry. But what you and I are doing right now, Danielle, is public speaking. And when you frame it like that, and you frame it as something that happens all the time, it breaks it down a little bit and makes it feel much more doable. And it kind of takes that big big fear and manages it a little bit. But the other thing is, even if you are afraid in any public speaking kind of realm, that is not a bad thing. Being nervous, it means you care. It means it matters to you how you perform and how you come across. And that is so much easier to work with than someone who just doesn't give a flip. So it's about just rechanneling that energy and reframing the conversation to make public speaking something that is commonplace, every day, no big deal. You got this.
I'm glad you touch on this mindset shift of what a speaker is,
Yeah.
because I ran into a similar situation. I spent 2 decades presenting in front of my colleagues, in front of customers. So I have been doing it my entire career. However, the minute I transitioned into becoming a professional speaker and full time, I remember the moment when people first started putting keynote speaker in front of my name. And I would get so nervous. But if they just put speaker, I was fine. And I don't know what it was about it. I finally had to mentally shift within my brain, remove the keynote, just be the speaker. And at the end of the day, when we shift our context into how we're viewing speaking, and instead of just worrying about what people are thinking about us, majority of the time they're thinking, I don't know how this person's doing that. I can never do that. But how can we serve the
Right.
people that are in the audience? It takes the pressure off of us. And you're right. Even the most seasoned speakers get nervous.
Yeah, 100%. And that's okay. It's that physiological response. There are ways to manage it. But just like anything challenging, the biggest block is usually the 6 inches between our ears, right? It is our mindset. It is that kind of emotional piece. And for me, there's three parts of navigating better the world of public speaking. That emotional piece, I think, is key. And that's usually what I cover last, just because it's the most in depth. But then there's also kind of the physical piece, which is learning tips and tricks to, again, manage that physiological response and also being familiar with your physical environment. That always helps. And then there's the social piece. And you are 100% right. It is not about us, it's about the audience. And so framing it that way and framing it in terms of, what does my audience want? What does my audience need? What's their perspective? What are they thinking about? What are their concerns? That social piece, preparing for that, can really help in taking the pressure off yourself and channeling some of that energy into, like you said, serving your audience in the best way that you can.
What was one of the challenges that you had when you were shifting from working in the corporate world, working in the public sector, to now saying, I'm going to go out on my own and I'm going to start a business? And there's a lot of risk that goes along with that. And I know that my listeners now, maybe even possibly thinking, is it maybe time to start a business, or do I stay where I'm at, or can I possibly do both? What steps did you take to overcome some of those fears and to be willing to take that risk?
Great question. I think the first thing I did was acknowledge that I couldn't figure it all out on my own. So I asked for help. I hired a coach. And that was, I think, the most important step that I took, again, was just acknowledging that this was going to be a journey where I needed support from people who'd already been there, done that. And I think another thing that helped was that I was pretty in touch with what my superpowers are, and immediately started thinking about, how was I going to leverage my superpowers to be successful in business. And one of my superpowers that I am the proudest of is, I'm a super connector. I love people and I love bringing people together. And so immediately I set out to talk to as many people as possible, find out what people's concerns and challenges were in this space, figure out people I could collaborate with and bring value to. And I think that having done some of that work to identify my superpowers, it really helps sort of accelerate things and allow me to jump in and be successful sooner rather than later. But the bottom line is business ownership is very hard. And I never thought it would be something that I would do. But I think you have to sometimes embrace those challenges. And I was at an inflection point where, okay, this is now or never. This is your chance to do this thing. And it's exciting, but yes, totally scary. And again, that's where being kind of a people person really, really helped because I was able to surround myself with support, with expertise. And that's something that everyone can really tap into.
Okay, so let's dig into this point where you said, I'm ready to do it, because everyone I feel like who's started a business has reached this defining point where they've said, I'm ready to make a change. And that could be for anyone listening. It could be, I'm ready to make a change in my career, whether it's pursuing a new job or promotion or making a change in our personal life. For you, it was leaving the corporate world and starting a business. So what was that pivotal moment where you said, I'm ready to make a change?
Yeah, I think it was actually not just one moment, but a few. I had been working in government and nonprofit on behalf of military and veteran families for almost 20 years. I was really proud of the work that I had done, and there was certainly more work left to do. But I will say that being a nonprofit executive director during COVID was probably the most challenging thing that I have ever had to go through. And it really kind of broke me down to a point where I had to have some tough conversations with myself about, is this the best way for you to serve? And not only is this the best way for me to serve, but is this a healthy thing for me? Am I as effective as I could be? Or am I struggling because this work, this job, this situation is impacting my mental health in a negative way? I loved all of the organizations I worked with and for in the veteran space and have all the respect in the world for that community. But sometimes it's just time to go. And I was feeling like there was a way for me to be healthier, more authentically myself, and more aligned with where I wanted to go in my future if I was in charge of my journey. When you work for someone else, there's only so much that you control. And so I felt like I was ready for more of that control, more of I get to decide how I'm going to spend my time and the projects that I'm going to take on and the people that I'm going to surround myself with.
That's a big, scary leap, though. The comforts of, and I want to say that I believe that there's a misconception of the security of having a paycheck, because at the end of the day, we're all a number when we're working for somebody else. So there's probably a little bit more security when you're working for an organization because you have the financial backing than you do starting your own business. But at the end of the day, anything can happen at any given moment. I've worked for organizations where we've laid off 20% of our sales force within one day. We've gone through restructuring. We've acquired different companies. So I believe that everything is always evolving and changing. But it's still a pretty scary jump to make, leaving the corporate world and also doing what you were doing for as long as you were to then doing something completely different.
Yeah. And I think that is a challenge that comes up very frequently in my work with clients where they'll say, I've been doing X for 15 years. I don't want to do X anymore, but I don't know what else I can do. People feel like they're much more limited because of the work that they've previously done. But my contention, and this is again, it's part of the assessing your superpowers and being able to communicate that, you can take any skill, any accomplishment, any expertise, and you can package it differently, speak about it differently to make it applicable to other types of roles. I'm always excited to take on a challenge of someone who says, well, I'm never going to be able to get this kind of job because it's completely unrelated to what I have been doing. Yeah, I know, absolutely not. You can communicate differently how to find those commonalities between two seemingly different things. I think that's also kind of one of my superpowers is finding those through lines and saying, ooh, okay, in this role, you use this skill this particular way, but we're going to talk about it differently and show how you can apply it in this completely different industry. I have not found anything yet that we can't find a way to connect. And I think as we move into the future and as work continues to evolve, I think that employers are being more flexible about things like that and taking deeper looks into people's background and skills and values versus just the job titles that you've held.
I agree with you 100%. I have been working with people that are looking for new jobs, and I consistently hear two things from individuals. One is, I want clarity. I know I'm feeling stuck and I want clarity on what I'm going to do next. And the other one is this block and this perception, well, I don't have industry experience or I don't have experience in that particular role. And often, as you said, it's going through the resume and saying, well, what skill sets are transferable? Where is that through line? And I've worked with clients who have completely shifted careers. One of them was a nurse, and then she ended up being in sales. I mean, very different, but we were able to look at some of those transferable skills
Right.
that were unique and removing those perceptions and roadblocks that we have so that we are building a career and a life that we love while also utilizing those superpowers that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And the system that I use to break this down, I call it powering up your potential. And I love talking about superpowers because I'm a big comic book nerd. I cosplay as Wonder Woman at conventions. I love all the nerdy movies, TV shows, all that good stuff. And so I challenge people the next time you watch a Marvel movie, think about the traits that your favorite superheroes have and how they could translate to real world scenarios. So there's kind of three steps in terms of the powering up your potential process. The first is you got to do some reflection, right? To figure out what your superpowers are. Some are going to be more obvious than others, but just like reflect on your past experiences, reflect on your interests. What are the things that you love that light you up? What are the experiences that you've had in your past that made you really proud or excited? So that's the first thing. Then start defining what your most distinctive attribute is. For me, it was this performance persona, this kind of comfort with being in front of people and speaking and presenting and performing on stage in front of others. So, what is that most distinctive attribute? If you asked your best friend or your closest work colleague, what is the one thing that sets you apart? What would they say? You could actually ask your colleagues and your friends. Be interesting to find out what those answers are and if they match up with your answer. And then the third is once you've kind of honed in on those distinctive attributes, validate that, refine that, use real world application to really hone those superpowers. And that's a really sort of super short description of the framework, but that's kind of the process that happens when I'm working with clients and we're really trying to drill down into, okay, as we're preparing you either for your next role or maybe a different role in your current organization, what are the things that we're going to be leveraging big time to sell you and all that you can do?
So, 3 steps to power up your potential.
That's right.
I like it. Identifying our superpowers. Now, we talk about grit in this podcast and unstoppable grit. And grit, by definition, is passion and perseverance towards long term goals. So, how have you seen grit play out through your life?
Man, I mean, the older we get, the more examples we pile up of this, right? Because there's nobody that goes through life without needing to tap into their grit. So it's just part of the human experience. I think for me, a really like light bulb experience happened pretty young in my life. I was diagnosed with cancer when I was 19 years old. And what became clear to me as I was dealing with that trauma was I needed to talk about it. That was the only way I was going to be able to process it. And in talking about it with others, I started developing this drive towards, well, how can I take this experience and make it better for the next person who has to deal with this? Or even better than that, make it so that nobody ever has to do this again. We're not quite there yet with cancer, but it led me to advocacy, which is another very specific type of communication. it led me to really being open and being that person who can share an experience in the hopes that it will help somebody else. And I think that's been a through line in my life. I failed the bar exam the first time I took it. That was another kind of grit moment. What does that say about me? And oh my gosh, I'm not smart and I'm never going to be successful. Well, no, it's a test and I failed and that sucked. But you get back up and you say, okay, what could I do differently to make the result different? So I changed the way that I studied and I passed it the next time. You mentioned my sommelier training. I tapped into that bar exam grit and resiliency that I developed when I took the sommelier exam. It's an extremely difficult test. And I went there and I did the best that I could, but I didn't think that I passed. But that resilience and grit that I developed from bar exam experience helped me to process as I left the exam site. I said, you know what? I'm proud of myself. I did it. I showed up. And if I didn't pass, I'll take it again. And I passed. So hooray. So I didn't have to take it again. But I think that COVID, again, working in the nonprofit space during COVID, also like a really, really difficult experience where I had to tap into that grit. And it can be really tempting to give up or get super down or just really question everything when you come up against challenges, when you come up against obstacles. And I'm a positive person, but I shy away from sort of this toxic positivity. But I do think that having a good support system and trying to focus as quickly as possible on what you can gain, what you can learn, what you can take with you from a negative experience, I think that's the key to unlocking that grit, unlocking that resilience. And once you develop that, it will serve you for your entire life. It's incredibly important resiliency. And just sometimes you got to go through some bad stuff to develop it. And that's just the trade-off.
Sometimes our superpower is the challenges that we've gone through and the steps that we've taken to overcome them ends up being our superpower in the long run. And it's beneficial when we face hardships and challenges to look back and think of what have we gone through? What steps do we take to overcome it? And how is that going to better prepare me for the situation that I'm currently in right now so that I can have the grit and resilience to overcome it and move forward?
Yeah. And think about going back to our fictional superheroes. They all have a traumatic origin story. I mean, think about Batman. The loss of his parents when he was a child springboarded him into being someone who sought justice in the world. And Spider-Man, the loss of his beloved uncle, helped him to learn with great power comes great responsibility. So these are fictional stories, but the reason that we like them and the reason why we respond to them is because there's parallels to our own lives. And so you might say, well, I'm no Batman, I'm no Spider-Man, but you are a superhero. You have your own superpower. And it's just a matter of figuring out what it is, leaning into it, and not being afraid to say, yeah, I'm really good at this. So let me help you.
Okay, because this is an interesting perspective because for a lot of times we are told, don't boast about yourself. We don't want to be perceived as narcissistic. Be humble. A lot of times we're told when we were younger, be humble. But what I'm hearing you say is lean in, embrace it, talk about it, and have that be your superpower.
Yeah, 100%. And there's a difference between being self-assured and being confident and being proud of your capabilities. There's a difference between that and being arrogant or being self-promoting. I think women in particular are kind of taught either explicitly or implicitly not to highlight themselves. And that is a habit that we have got to break. Because if nobody knows what your superpower is or how you can help, then how are they going to bring you to the place where you can make a difference? And a lot of it is subtle, right? So it takes practice. It takes practice not only to get comfortable speaking about yourself, but also to do it in a way that doesn't feel braggy or gross. Again, it's all about packaging that communication in such a way that you're sharing the information without being a jerk about it. And there are a lot of course, I'm not going to be able to come up with a single name right now, but there are a lot of women who are really good at this. And again, it just takes practice. But yeah, you can't keep your superpower to yourself. You have to use it for the betterment of your community, your family, the country, the world, whatever speaks to you. But even if you're making an impact for one other person, that's a huge, huge thing in the ripple effects that that will cause.
Using our superpowers to make an imprint on the world. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now we talk about this difference between self-promotion and a narcissistic. There's those people that you know that just it makes you feel super uncomfortable. And then there's also, you say that there are people that are really good at highlighting their superpowers. Can you share with us maybe a specific way that we could talk about our superpower without coming across as narcissistic? Maybe a promotion comes up or a particular special project comes up and we want to raise our hand for it and we want to talk about, hey, we've got this superpower, but how does that conversation go?
I think the big distinction to make, and I'll try to do a quick example, throwing out like a title or an award or some kind of vanity metric, that's going to sound braggy. But talking about the actual action that you undertook, the actual steps that you took, and the result that you got. So instead of saying, I won the Big Importance Guy Award for 2022, you can say, I was able to motivate our team to work better together and achieve XYZ result for the company, for whoever the stakeholder is. So it's something where if anybody's done performance-based interviewing, it's going to sound kind of familiar, but it's less about the title or the fancy words that probably nobody understands but you and your company, and more about, again, that impact. What is the actual impact that you're making? And being able to tie this into your superpower will make this easier. The more you talk about it, the more you'll sort of get a sense for what gets the right response without crossing over into that kind of unpleasant, gross self-promotion territory.
Okay, I think I have an example for us here. I could say I earned Region Manager of the Year. That sounds very braggy, very promoty. And as you said, a vanity title versus I worked for an organization where we laid off 20% of our sales force in one day. And our team was feeling very demotivated. There was a lot of fear and uncertainty on whether they were going to still have a job. And by leading with empathy and compassion and heart-centered leadership, we were collectively able to come together as a team and eventually finished as the number one team in the nation.
Yes. Yeah, exactly that. Exactly that. Because that's meaningful. Because at the heart of that statement that you just made is people. And so, yes, you're talking about what you were able to motivate them to do, but you're centering yourself less and acknowledging that there were challenges that you all faced and that you achieved something together. And that, yeah, I mean, it's that simple. And again, now you are very good at this, Danielle. So
I was
that
going to say,
example,
let's also say that you and I both do interview coaching for a living. So it does, right? If you're listening and you're going, wait, what did you say? That just came across so natural. Understand that I do interview coaching for a living. This is what I teach. So it comes a lot more naturally over years and years of practice.
Yeah. And one way I love to get people to practice this too is kind of in the elevator pitch territory. Networking is my favorite kind of public speaking to talk about. It's one of my favorite things to do. It's something that gets a really bad rap because a lot of people do it so badly. But in networking, sometimes it feels really awkward, right? To introduce yourself to a new person and they're like, what do you do? The age-old question that you get. And then it's like, ugh, do I talk about my title? You freeze because you're like, ugh. And most people just say, I'm a senior analyst for whoever company. And again, that's kind of like, all right, that's a title. It's pretty meaningless. So frame your elevator pitch in terms of who you serve and how. And that's another really good way to sort of practice this talking about yourself in a non narcissistic way. The thing that I use a lot is I help people who want to impact positive change by speaking up and speaking out. That's the action that I'm taking. That's the impact that I'm having. If I say, I'm a professional speaker, coach, and consultant, like, what does that mean? And what did you get from that? So it takes practice, but you can practice in a lot of different contexts, even if you're practicing in the written word. So on your LinkedIn profile or on your resume, those are ways that you can also practice with how you're communicating your value proposition in a way that feels comfortable for you, but that still highlights all the amazing things that you can do.
And this can sometimes be a challenge too, because we've tied so much of our identity a lot of times to our title. I'm a mom, I'm a spouse, I'm a senior analyst, whatever that title is. So when we're asked specifically, what do you do? Who are you? How do you show up in the world? It can be really challenging. And it's encouraged to sit down and think about what you do. And the way that you had said who you serve versus your title piques curiosity. And that
Yeah.
opens up a conversation. Tell me more. It's interesting. I want to add to this challenge of coming up with this. What do you do? Today, I went to my kids' school and it was Great American Teach Day. So I sat in front of 46-year-olds, which I have
That's a
all
lot.
praise and respect for our teachers,
Yes.
trying to get 46-year-olds to sit while I talked for maybe 20 minutes. But and coming in and them and explaining to 6-year-olds what I do for a living and explaining it without being I'm a speaker and an author. It's how do I serve? And then asking them, what do they want to be? So it was an
Mhm.
interesting challenge that was presented today. But I agree with you. Sit down and really think about who you serve, what you do, what impact you want to make, what's that ripple effect and the imprint that you want to leave on the world. And that is what can be your superpower.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, if you can explain who you are and how you serve and how you show up in the world to a group of 6-year-olds, I think you're on the right track because we don't need all kinds of fancy words and titles. Strip that away and think about at your core what's important to you. And I think that is maybe the like through line of this whole conversation, which is alignment with yourself and your values. It's going to help you when you're trying to figure out if you need to make a change in your life, in your career. It's going to help you when you talk about how you show up and what you can do and how you can help people make an impact. And it's going to ultimately be your kind of thermometer for, am I on the right track? When you don't feel aligned, you can tell. And those are those inflection points. Those are those times when you got to dig deep, do the work, figure out what your superpower is and how you want to bring it to the rest of the world.
So much to unpack in our conversation today.
Yes.
And I believe at this particular conversation, it's a matter of if you're driving right now, this is a conversation that you want to re-listen to. You want to grab a piece of paper. You want to write down those 3 steps that Betty talked about so that you can uncover your superpower.
Absolutely. And it can be uncomfortable, but ultimately, we all have something really special to offer. And I can't wait to hear and read conversations that are started after this one. And I'm always excited to jump in and help if there's anything I can do to help people feel more comfortable in their superpowered self.
Well, I would love to hear too, when it comes to people's superpower, when you're listening and you sit down and you write down and you determine kind of what that superpower is, the potential that you get to elevate, share it on social media and tag Betty and I. Our social media handles are in the show notes, and we would love to hear from you what your superpower is and share that ripple effect with others around us. And before we end our conversation and wrap up our conversation today, I've got one very important question for you.
Okay.
As a certified sommelier, what is your favorite drink of choice?
I mean, bubbles. Always
Bubbles.
bubbles. Sparkling wine, it's the key to life. It is celebratory, it is fun, it is light, it is such an interesting product. We have sparkling wine because somebody made a mistake hundreds of years ago in trying to make regular wine. So it's this beautiful mistake that has turned into this incredible celebratory substance. And for those of you out there who like to pair your wine with food, here's a tip. Sparkling wine is the ultimate food pairing cheat. You can pair sparkling wine with just about anything. And it's good on its own, it's good with food. So that's always the way to go. Bubbles, bubbles for life.
I may just be popping open a bottle of champagne tonight for some bubbles. I'm going to agree with you. Bubbles are always happy. Those are my happy
Yeah,
drinks.
I think I'm going to do the same. And I will cheers to you and all of your listeners and all of their amazing superpowers.
So that's another thing too. If you go to pop open a bottle of bubbly and you want to tag us on Instagram, Facebook, whatever social media platform you're using, we will cheers to you too. Well,
Absolutely.
for those of you listening, thank you so much for tuning in. And if you've ever wanted to know what is your superpower, this is your opportunity to take some time, reflect, and uncover the potential that lies ahead for you. This is your time to take some time to accelerate in whatever goals that you want to achieve and have that grit to be unstoppable. Thanks for tuning in and see you next week.